Make sure you check out our online store where we work with our graphic designer to create stunning garment and product designs that feature a wide variety of aircraft types such as British fighters, World War II aircraft, American bombers, Russian fighters and much more. You can pick your favourite designs and personalise any items within our Redbubble store that range from clothing right the way through to stationery. All of our designs feature our logo so you can show your support for the channel while getting a quality product. You can head to our website aircrewinterview.tv and click store, or go to redbubble.com/people/AC interview. Thank you and enjoy.
So I got streamed to go Phantoms, and that was one of the very, very first courses where they had just introduced the Hawk to Broady, but they still had the Hunter T7 and the Hunter FGR2 and F6 there, but they had Hawks there for ab initio pilots. So all the Hunters did all the refresher training, and the Hawks did ab initio pilots. And they decided, in their wisdom, which is a very good idea, that all these guys would go off in a two-seat Hawk because there were so many previously single-seat Hunters. Why not put a baby Navigator in the back? Well, they didn't actually put us. I don't think they actually. I think the original idea was, if you had Pilot Officer Jones and he was streamed to go Phantoms, then put Pilot Officer Smith as a navigator in the back of a Hawk with them, and off they go together. Mm-hmm. But it never quite worked like that because they never trusted Pilot Officer Jones to fly with a baby navigator. So, it was strange that 2 months later they'd let you go off and fly in a Mach 2 Phantom, but they wouldn't let you fly together in a Hawk. But at least all of a sudden, you thought you were the ace of the base, wearing your little leg restraints on a Jake Provost Mark 5, click-clocking around, and then you go to Broady and you get a G-suit and you fly an airplane that can pull 9G, and then you suddenly realise that you're not the ace of the base at all, because the other leveler is, and again, I'm not decrying navigators, but you reach the pinnacle of your navigation training and they say to you, right, you're posted to Phantoms, and you think you're the best person in the world. You've reached the top of your pinnacle, and you get to Broady and you meet a guy who is 6 months ahead of you in the Air Force, but he's a pilot, and all of a sudden you're getting in a formation and watching this guy flying his Hawk around at low level with his two sneb cams and his sidewinders, and you're there with a paper map, and you're sort of going, okay, well, maybe I'm not quite the ace of the base yet. So again, I'm not decrying backseaters, but it was a bit of a leveler to me to think that I'd reached this pinnacle, and I thought, wow. And I looked at these other guys who were 20, and I thought, I've still got a long way to go. They were doing the briefing, getting the aircraft, leaving the formation, flying around in bad weather, getting bounced, doing combat, and I'm thinking, But one day I thought, hopefully I would get there. So I did the course. I went to the Phantom OCU, which again I found incredibly difficult. I found the ground school. Incredibly taxing in terms of the amount of knowledge they wanted you to know from memory. So there was, you had flight reference cards and you had memory drills, but pretty much they wanted you to know how the airplane worked back to front, which I always found that was a side of my aviation skills that I was never very, and probably still am not very good at, is retaining that knowledge of how an F-4 works, or a Lightning works, or a Mirage works. And the Phantom OCU then was some huge, great unit that had aeroplanes from the letter A to the letter Z. So they must have had 26 or so, 2 or 3 courses, but we never flew. I look at my logbook and I flew something like the 3rd of October, and then it would be the 18th of October, and then the 27th of October. And it was literally, every week or 2 weeks, and then there'd be a big, burst of maybe 2 or 3 trips. And being a navigator, of course, the pilots had to do the initial convex 1, 2, 3, or 4. Then they do an instrument rating test and do a night check. So they were always doing pretty much twice what a navigator was doing. And from a navigator's point of view, there weren't many trips that you did which didn't involve you getting the radar out. So the instrument rating test where you went off and flew with a pilot and did a practice diversion, you didn't take the radar out much then, but there wasn't much you could do in the early phase of the course until you went on to intercepts, and then you started doing what they call, bread and butter medium level intercepts, where you would do 180 by 8s and 150 degree attacks and 120 and 90 degree attacks at medium level. Then you went down to low level, but there was no evasion, and then there was a combat phase. So it was very, very basic on the F-4 SU, but still very demanding. And I looked at my logbook a couple of days ago, and I literally did, I don't know, 25 hours or so. And the last sortie I did, the first time the radar failed, second time the camera on the radar failed, third time something went wrong with the aeroplane. And I think the very last sortie, they just said, you've passed, it's all right, off you go. But I felt very under-equipped and ill-prepared to go to Germany. Having left Coningsby, which is Sleepy Hollow on the East Coast, in the UK defence region, to pack your car with your little green bag of helmet, life preserver, G-suit, drive to Germany, and all of a sudden, literally like out of some Man Alive film, and I suppose I was reasonably lucky that I'd lived in Wildenrath for 3 or 2 years as a child, so it wasn't totally strange to me. But you rock up at the main gate, and the bloke's there with a pistol and a rifle, and the IRA were pretty prevalent then.
Yeah.
And you ID, and they check your car for a bomb underneath. You go to the officer's mess, and everyone's around there, and they're all very operational and punchy, and they haven't got their badges on their flying suit because they want to be tactical. So you rock up there, and then the first day I arrived on the squadron was Carnival Day, and one of the older navigators, or he seemed old then, he was about 28, Peter Gilmore, who'd come off Shackleton's, he sort of said, right, come with me. You're not going to go to the squadron to arrive today. You're doing the carnival. And it was a bit like something out of Animal House, which later became our sort of trademark film. But 5 hours later, I was deposited back at Wildenrath, completely inebriated, with about, I don't know, 10 pints of strong German beer inside me, feeling absolutely dreadful, no idea what was going on at all. And he thought this was very amusing, as did the rest of the squadron. And I went to bed that night and thought, I really feel bad. And the next morning at 8:30, I had to go and have my initial interview with the station commander. And I just managed to get my number ones on, and I just managed to get out of bed. And I sat in his office, and I looked, I probably was white as a sheet, and he gave me this huge lecture about the problems of drink and about how the airmen can drink too much, and you've got to set an example, and you mustn't get drink. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm actually going to be sick any minute now. I'm going to throw up. And I was just so hungover and so ill.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is not a good start to my tour in Germany. And so I went back to the squadron, obviously, that day, and there's a mass of forms you have to fill in, and you have to go around every unit on the station and get your gas mask and your chemical warfare suit, and then you have to go to the simulator and do a sim, which is at Bruggen, and then off you go and do your first flight. And I probably hadn't flown a Phantom for 3 weeks or so I was absolutely hopeless. I couldn't remember how to align the inertial, and you had to get in the front seat and do checks in the front and then get into the back. And it was all very, very laborious. But I think you maybe got one, what was called a famille flight. And I flew with it. I think it was a guy who later became a test pilot on my first trip. And we just did this navigation exercise. And I was, had my map out, and I was trying to work out where we were. And I'd never flown low level in Germany before. And yeah, it was big boy stuff and a big learning curve.
Imagine.
Then I got crewed up with my pilot, a guy called Andy Neal, who was about 5'3", and his nickname was Knick Knack. And he was about the punchiest small man you could ever meet. And he's a brilliant pilot and a brilliant instructor, but boy, he didn't take any prisoners. Anything you did wrong, he would tear you off a strip straight away, even a foot shorter than me. But a fantastic guy to fly with. I learned a huge amount with him, became operational and, jumping ahead, and then got crewed up with the squadron boss, which was a huge privilege, because the squadron bosses were normally not very sharp, they didn't fly very much, and to get crewed up with him was quite an honour. So I flew with a guy called Reg Hallam, who was the squadron boss, and he was a fantastic test pilot, cool as a cucumber, very laid back, very old school. And again, I learned a massive amount about flying from him, that nothing's ever really, that serious that's going to cause you concern to actually break out into a sweat. Absolutely. And, he was the coolest guy I've ever flown with, I think. And I once said to him, what was, in all the flying you've ever done, what was the most alarming, scary, nerve-wracking moment you ever had? And this is a guy who flew Javelins, he flew Phantoms. He was the boss of the Empire Test Pilot School. So you imagine that he's done all sorts of things in his career. And I expect him to say, well, I got into a spin, I couldn't get out of a spin, and I recovered at 200 feet. He said, oh, and he thought about it. He said, I think the worst thing that ever happened was flying in a Shackleton, and I had a chip pan fire in the galley. And he said, I looked back, he said, and I looked down the galley, and there was a pan of chips on fire. And he said, that was pretty serious. And I've always kept that in my memory, because when you think about it, actually, it is pretty serious.
It's pretty serious, yeah.
A fire inside the aircraft with a pan of chips.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it wasn't what you'd expect, an engine fire or an electrical problem or something like that. So, yeah.
So, Ian, what did you do after your Phantom tour?
Well, I was on a 3-year tour, and I was on a thing called a short service commission. So I knew I had 8 years in the Air Force, and I knew at the end of Germany, my options were probably to go to the weapons instructor course, and then be a QY, a qualified weapons instructor, and then go to a Lucas squadron or a Watersham or somewhere. And pretty early on, I'd always tried to engineer, having spoken to my father, how could I become a pilot? And the first year I flew in Germany, it was great fun. The second year, I was learning everything like a sponge. And the third year, I felt very vulnerable and sitting in the back seat because I knew I wanted to be a pilot. So I think I've written a couple of books, but I flew with the station commander, a guy called John Allison, who's a very famous pilot. And I was always happy to fly with anybody, really, whereas other people weren't. So off we went on a very poor visibility day, almost had a mid-air collision, and I managed to save the pair of us, as it were, without sounding too dramatic. I could tell you the whole story, but it would take up a whole interview. And he obviously was impressed with me, and he said, well, if you want to go and be a pilot, I'll back you. And so I had the backing of the station one, I had the backing of my father, and I became a pilot. The pilot training bit, is outside the scope of this interview, but at the end of it, I became a Lightning pilot, which is going to be short-lived because the Lightning only had less than 2 years left to go in service. And I guess it was very lucky that I got the Lightning with so long to go. They probably could have kept guys on it, but they were at that time thinking that we were going to be the next generation of Eurofighter pilots, but that never really happened. So I flew the Lightning for 2 years, went to the Tornado and did all the stuff on the Tornado that I could possibly do. And the natural thing then was either to go to the Red Arrows or go to the weapons course or do an exchange tour. I've flown with the Red Arrows quite a few times, and much as I love what they do and everything, it wasn't really for me because I had a passion for flying fast jets and doing operational stuff, and I also had a passion for photography, and I just knew that if I was in the Red Arrows, I wouldn't be flying with my left hand and taking a picture with my right hand, and they'd probably get very annoyed with me. So I knew that was not for me, really.